Hello, Imhotep, and welcome. I'm Mog Morgan, companion of Set and Knight of Shambhala, and this is the Egyptian Magic Podcast. So today, the topic is the god Horus, whose sacred month we're just beginning for the entire lunar month. But before starting talking about this important Egyptian god, I promised I'd say something about this system of 13 Typhonian gods or supernatural entities, which I kind of mentioned in the preamble or the promise of this talk. Strictly speaking, the term Typhonian itself, it's usually related to the god Set, or Seth if you like, and his mythology. He's the Typhonian god par excellence, really. Typhon being just a translation into Greek, or the equivalent in Greek of the Egyptian name Seth. The Greeks in Egypt, they called Seth Typhon. And there's some sort of parallel between the two different traditions over this god. But I think you could extend that a little bit more and say that there's actually there's a collection of family, if you like, of gods who are broadly Typhonian, some of which are kind of avatars or descendants or companions as well of Set, and some of whom kind of share some of his characteristics, which would be Set is one of the things. Set is kind of known as quite a passionate, maybe even violent entity in the Egyptian tradition, and he's usually associated with quite dangerous animals, like very, very venomous serpents, the hippopotamus and the crocodile, and several other entities which I'll mention. So you could say that there are likely to be other Typhonian entities within the Egyptian tradition. What I was also thinking about is I have this reconstructed system, which I kind of been promulgating for a while now, which tracks back to some very old data or strata of belief in Egypt. When the lunar mysteries and lunar symbolism was much more dominant. This wasn't particularly well known. It's more well known now since people like myself have been kind of writing about it. It's not always obvious that there was this lunar mythology that started out before the more popular Egyptian mythologies of later times. Lunar symbolism was dominant. And this also coincides with a particular moment within the Egyptian culture when you had two kind of power centers within Egypt. You had the center of Ombos, which was the citadel of Set, really, the ancient Setian people that existed in the ancient world, and the citadel of the followers of Horus. And these two centers are all both in Upper Egypt. Or there's probably another version from Lower Egypt as well. But the point being that they're kind of, it's been likened to a game of Monopoly in a way. You have these two ancient centres and settlements and cities, and they're kind of in competition with each other in terms of trade and development, and depending on who builds the most hotels, who kind of in the game of Monopoly, who develops their resources the quickest, and therefore has spare resources to do things like compete with their neighbours or fight with their neighbours, all of which cost money. They coexist for a little while, and then in the end maybe one of them gets the upper hand. And there's a kind of important theory in Egypt that at some point in the prehistoric or early dynastic period, the Horus Center got the upper hand and kind of took over, if you like, and the Ombos Center was left to fall into it was depopulated and was always known about. People used to go there and to kind of make offerings and stuff, but essentially it declined and it disappeared. And in terms of mythology, its beliefs and ideas have an underground existence, or an existence that's sort of demonized, if you like. It's almost like an ethnic group sometimes that is on the back foot. Now, my idea is that the onbites, if you like, the onbite sort of point of view would be much more lunar, or kind of corresponds. Their moment of hegemony in the ancient world would have also coincided when the lunar calendar was much more common and popular. So I often call my stuff the onbite or onboss recension, in the sense that I'm taking it back to another kind of set of mythology in Egypt, because you always have a choice. You see, it's all these things, these different systems coexist and exist at different times. So you have a choice of which one you choose to kind of relate to, and I think there are all sorts of important reasons, which I've talked about many times, of why the lunar system is something that we do need to take note of and in fact reclaim when we're kind of thinking about Egyptian system. So what I call the onboss recension, it goes back to familiar deities. It goes back to a time when maybe some deities are less familiar and some are more familiar. So some of the ones that are more well known, like your Isis and your Osiris and whatever. The further you go back in time, maybe there's not so much record of mythology connected with them, and you have other deities who from an older ancestral time that were more important. And it just so happens, if you map these, if you look at the original lunar calendar of Egypt, it seems obvious that each month of the lunar cycle seemed to be named after and perhaps dominated by a particular god or goddess. This is not absolutely the case for every month, but you can trace it in pretty much all of them. And in a sense, if you look at it that way, the lunar system, there's almost like a lunar family, if you like, an onboss family, a particular group of gods who seem to be the oldest strata of belief. And those gods, I would say, are the 13 Typhonian entities, or you could sort of consider them as 13 Typhonian entities, or gods with some closer relationship to the god Set. And and it would include the god Set. He has his own month, which is the first month of the year. It can be that. But they'll be relatives of his, or some that have some sort of relationship with him. And if I give you a quick run through of the sequence, so obviously not obviously, but it is the case that the sun god Ra has probably always been, as well as the moon, the worship of the sun and solar worship has always been a very, very ancient strata of belief. So you have the sun god Ra. Now, Set is a manifestation of the god Ra. He's a particular manifestation of the god Ra that he kind of makes in order to achieve certain things, usually to do with protection and battle and all the rest. Set is the emanation of Ra, who he kind of emanates in order to kind of to go to battle or to defend himself. So there's Ra. There's the god Thoth himself. Thoth connected, also a lunar deity, perhaps connected more with the full moon. And not so well known that Thoth is actually, in some pieces of mythology, is actually the offspring of the god Set. He could even be said to resemble a god Set in some ways, the kind of unusual appearance of both gods. But whatever, in a very sort of well-known, or perhaps not so well-known piece of mythology, Thoth is actually engendered by Set, he comes out of Set's head, if you like. Set gives birth to him in a kind of unusual way as a result of a kind of incident with Horus, in fact. So you've got Thoth. You could include him as a kind of Typhonian deity, and he does have certain Typhonian aspects as well. There's a god called Min, or Amon Min sometimes, who is always shown naked with an erection, and is a very, very, probably one of the oldest deities within Egypt. He has Setian connections or similarities, put it that way. He's associated with the desert and protection of people in the desert, which is an important aspect of Set as well. This may seem trivial, but he enjoys the same food as Set, which is the lettuce or some sort of plant. It's some sort of wild lettuce, probably from the ancient world, and it's significant that they both eat this particular food. There may be something about it that is magical that we're missing. He's also associated with thunderstorms, and this is also an important aspect of Setian mythology, that Set is associated with rainfall and thunder in some accounts. So there's quite a lot in common between the two entities. Grandmother of the god Neath. She figures quite a lot in the mythology of other gods, but there must have been a stage. She's actually the mother. We say as the grandmother, but that means she must have been the mother of the gods as well. But her kind of role in later times is kind of on the back foot, so it's more like the grandmother of the gods, and she has a kind of quite a martial aspect as well, quite a kind of she's described as a warrior woman who wears men's clothing when necessary, and so she kind of has this ambiguous martial nature to her, which I'd say is quite Typhonian in its way. There's the sky goddess Newt, or Nuit. She is, of course, the mother of the gods, but particularly singled out as the mother of Set. So there's obviously something the Egyptians wanted people to take note of, that he's called son of Nut, and they're often pictured together. And she has a special role that she kind of sets out for Set, and so I think, and also some bits of her mythology, which are connected with the Setian things, are quite Typhonian, really, or quite sort of can be interpreted that way. Specifically, the thing that she is said to actually eat her own children. She gives birth to them, she eats them, and there's a kind of complicated explanation on why that might be there. But on the face of it, it's quite a kind of taboo aspect to her cult. There's Horus himself, but especially in the form of the crocodile, perhaps as Sobek, but as Horus crocodile. We'll explore in a minute that there's quite a lot of different avatars of Horus, but Horus the crocodile, Chentiket, to give him his Greco-Egyptian name, that's a very much more lunar aspect of the important god Horus, and as such is definitely connects him with Set, and I'd say gives him a more Typhonian aspect. And some aspects of the cult of the Horus crocodile are to do with things like quite violent as well, sort of fire walking and putting enemies of into the fire. So I'd say that was quite a Typhonian aspect, but certainly the crocodile itself is a very ambiguous entity in the text, and often occurs in quite a taboo function. So it can be sometimes difficult to determine whether this is a form of Set. sometimes the experts say you can't really tell whether they're talking about Set or whether they're talking about some aspect of Horus. There's Soca. Soca is the much older version of the Lord of the Dead and of the Underworld, whose form kind of morphs into that of Osiris in later times. But certainly Soca, the mysteries of Soca in the Underworld, alchemical mysteries, the kind of dissolving of the body into fluid and then a reconstitution of it. These are all kind of Typhonian mysteries, I think, as Lord of the Underworld. There's Nyarlathotep, the serpent goddess. Remembering that another very, very old strata of belief in Egypt would be the serpent cult, and so many of these entities have serpent or snake avatars, some of which are kind of quite scary. I mean, the whole idea of a world of where all the gods and goddesses are in this serpentine form is in itself quite taboo breaking and scary. But this is a very old strata of belief. And Nyarlathotep, the harvest goddess, she kind of is a survival of that ancient serpent cult, or Ophidian cult, which is another name people give to the Typhonian tradition. And that might include some of the big creator deities behind the scenes, the primordial ones such as the Noon, which is a chaotic, colossal serpent, a giant serpent, and of course connected with that is Apophis, the serpent of non-being. All of these things relate, I think, in some way to Nyarlathotep and the serpent cult. There's the moon god Khonsu, who is first mentioned in the earliest records in the pyramid texts. Khonsu is a very aggressive lunar deity. And most famously, there's this thing called the cannibal hymn in the pyramid texts, in which Khonsu is kind of consuming the other gods. And this is quite a complicated idea, but certainly this cannibal hymn connects us with the Ombos tradition, really. In a way, maybe we'll discuss that another time, how the original citadel of the Ombites, Ombos, is there's some sort of evidence of what you might call elective cannibalism, not killing people in order to eat them, but some sort of cannibal rites to do, or symbolic cannibal rites to do with the funeral and with your ancestors. Rather than the mummification, there's a kind of cannibal thing. And this strata of belief persists through as a sort of underground tradition within the later times as well. It's a very, very interesting topic. So Khonsu, we might say connected more with the crescent moon, whereas Thoth, you could say, is the full moon. Then, of course, we have the hippo goddess, a very, very ancient entity, and being a hippo, which is one of the important avatars of Set, although the male and the female hippos were almost treated as different species in a way, thought to have different temperaments. So the male hippo is definitely more violent, Setian, scary thing, whereas the female hippo, Tawaret, being one name, is also, but it's also called the concubine of Set, and gives birth to certain Typhonian entities herself. So I think we've got to count her as a Typhonian entity, and she's often shown with this crocodile on her back, or a serpent Apophis, and she's linked with the constellation Draco. So there you go, a Typhonian thing, if for want of a better word. And you've got Anubis, is another very ancient jackal god to do with funerals and mummifications in later times. The weird thing about Anubis is that he's often mistaken for the god Set, and there's a sort of interplay between the two different mythologies, and he's often criticized in myth for the fact that he is quite Typhonian, and some versions of images of Anubis is really obvious. It's quite demonic looking deity when he wants to be. So it definitely counts as, a Typhon. As with so many of these things, the Typhonian entities sort of come on side, if you like. They kind of moderate their things. I should say Hathor as well will be another example of a very ancient entity who definitely has these Typhonian violent propensities to cannibalism and genocide even at times, but this is moderated and becomes part of another story. But in her oldest form, it's very much part of that. So I think that's 13 entities, deities that all have part of this Typhonian point of view. And I'm talking about a strata of belief that this is before the building of the pyramids, certainly before the building of Joseph's pyramid. The building of Joseph's pyramid is usually said to coincide with the introduction of the more familiar civil calendar that people kind of make so much of. So that would be the moment in which the lunar calendar was kind of pushed to another place. Really, became obsolete, or became something that only experts in Egypt knew about, the priests knew about, and used it for ruling certain important magical events. Okay, so let's look at Horus, also known as the royal god in some accounts. Egyptologists, it's a quote, recognize about, I'm told, 40 different forms of the god Horus. And it can be difficult to say, are they all separate gods? Are they all kind of just manifestations of Horus in different ways? But wherever you look at it, there's a lot of different forms, rather than the kind of common one we know of as the Horus, the falcon entity. Horus, as I say, you can have Horus the crocodile, which we're going to talk about as one of the important ones, and all sorts of different, Horus the child, Horus just the king, Horus, all sorts. But there's at least 40 different versions of this, depending on which bit of Egypt and what particular lesson you want to make. Someone mentioned in that quote about the 40 that of all the 40, it's difficult, if you know something about Aleister Crowley and his very strong devotion to the god Horus as manifest in this channel text Liber Al, or the Book of the Law, which Horus gets two goes in that. It's not always obvious that Hadit in his system is actually just another name for Horus. But in the final book, he's got another form of Horus, Horus of the horizon. And that particular third book of Crowley's, it was, as someone said, it was a ghastly vision of Horus. It's quite depressing, really, quite violent. It's almost apocalyptic. And people have said, well, they don't really recognise the Egyptian Horus in that, and they probably got a point, really. Although it has to be said, there is something in the idea of Horus as a kind of as looked to as a sort of revolution, apocalypse. Well, take the apocalypse itself in the terms of the New Testament book of Revelation, and you have this kind of prophecy of the end of the world and the return of some sort of saviour who's going to kind of rule for a certain amount of time and sort everything out. From this has got a very Egyptian context as well, and there are lots of similar texts to be found within Egypt itself, in which there is a hope, because Egypt was, certainly towards the end, was kind of conquered by its neighbours, and, if you like, non-native Egyptians ruled as kings for a while, until eventually the whole culture was kind of cancelled in for want of a better word. And there's this thing called the Potter's Oracle, which people are always dreaming. The native Egyptians themselves were always dreaming of the return of the king, of the return of Horus, who'd come and abolish all the bad things that had happened, that all the kind of invaders had introduced, and that there would be a new age. And there's something between that idea of the Potter's Oracle and this hope and the mythology of Horus. And that involves, as I say, revolution and violence and whatever, but then a new age. So you can't say that, I mean, perhaps Crowley was aware of that, but it's difficult to say that what his main influences for that would have been probably just the Bible. In the Ombos recension, in my own way of looking at this, I focus a lot on the lunar form of Horus. But of course, Horus is more well known for the part he plays in a famous story, or what we might call the Passion Play of Egypt. And this is the kind of story of Isis and Osiris and Horus, the generation of 5 for what's sometimes called the cursed gods. Cursed because they weren't really supposed to exist. The 5 of them weren't really supposed to come into existence, but this happened within a particular mythic time frame. The 5 gods would be Isis and Osiris and Set, we've already mentioned, and his partner Nephthys, and another Horus, a Horus god, but not Horus, perhaps not the most well-known Horus, but as I say, yet another form of Horus. This is Horus the Elder, that existed, who also has a very interesting mythology, which we could also say is Typhonian, in which he's seen to be almost a vampiric god, one of the origins of the vampire myth, according to some ways of looking at this. So that myth, even though I'm kind of looking at other things, that obviously that myth is an incredibly important myth. The story of a kind of dynastic struggle within Egypt, which is played out initially in the divine realm amongst the gods, and as is known, Seth tricks his brother, because Seth and Osiris are brothers in this particular myth, and which again is interesting. They're kind of not just brothers; they're kind of almost can change places in many ways. But whatever, Seth has designs to take over, and he tricks and he kills his brother Osiris so that he can take absolute power for himself, which is an ideal within Egyptian. You see, in the older lunar times, there was more of an idea that you might share power, but in this newer dynastic time, it has to be one main man or main woman in control. So he tricks Osiris and he kills him so that he take power for himself. You can also look at that as a sort of initiation. He almost initiates Osiris, or turns Osiris into the Lord of the Underworld, to take over that role of Soca that we mentioned earlier. And Osiris has to kind of go through this process in order for him to take this very, very important role within the mythology of the Lord of the Underworld. These are the two main cults, really, the cult of Osiris in the underworld and the cult of the sun. So it's a sort of diabolical initiation, you'd say. Set is quite a nasty ordeal type thing of dissolution. Now, as is well known as well, that Isis, who is Osiris's partner, she has managed to conceive a child, which is another entity called Horus the child now. And even that part of it is quite full of interest in magic, sexual magic, some of it. All of this stuff kind of permeates this material. But whatever way you look at it, Osiris makes this brief return, so he's resurrected, but not for very long before he returns to the underworld. But enough time for a child to be produced, supposedly, by Isis, although obviously this is a source of some speculation amongst the gods. But being a child and having this incredibly powerful uncle, Set, still in the frame and now in control of all the power, is a very, very dangerous position to be the kind of heir apparent, but having no power and whatever. So potentially you're the next one, because you'll be seen as a danger to the continuation, because sooner or later you're going to claim, well, this should have been me, I should be in control. So Isis, knowing this, takes Horus off under her protection as a child, who's not a very strong child either, because of the nature of his paternity. She takes him into the delta, and they hide out there, which is a very productive myth within the Egyptian tradition. And he's allowed to grow up, right? To grow up to become a man. So that to train as a warrior, so then he can lead the forces of whatever, of revolution, I suppose, and reclaim his birthright, so called. And all the different episodes of this are played out in the course of a ritual cycle over a year, and it's full of magic on a state level, but also quite magic for people, all stems from this. A good example of this is it occurs again in the motif of Horus of the Crocodile House. You can have Horus as a crocodile, but you can have Horus among the crocodiles as well, because being a swampy area of the Nile, especially at that period of time, it's full of all sorts of dangerous Typhonian entities, like the crocodile, which, being kind of related to Set, would also have a sort of interest in killing Horus, as would all of the many other entities that live in that kind of marshy environment, the snakes and the biting insects and the scorpions and all sorts of things that have all got it in potentially for Horus, and they're all Typhonian entities who kind of want to play a part of that. So what comes from that, one way or another, is a very, very interesting piece of magic, which we can still, I say, not just that we could still make use of, but it is still, lies at the heart of a lot of the magic that people do. And this is connected with Horus of the crocodiles. They actually have these images, these magical artifacts, or piece of magical technology really, that represent this image of Horus as a child, standing on a crocodile but holding dangerous entities in his hands, which potentially ought to kill him, to be very dangerous. But Isis has kind of worked out this method. She's been taught this method by the people in the swamp to protect them against the bites and of venomous creatures, and also from dangerous animals like the crocodile that might do them. And it leads to the idea that if you take this image, so you've got piece of image magic, this is the Egyptian way, this is the way. You take these images, they're called, the little stone sort of image things with an image of Horus on them. You pour some liquid over this thing. This was a common thing in old temples, not just to do with Horus, but as a common technique. You pour beer or just water over it. It absorbs the story it absorbs some of the story that's written on the object, plus the images on the object. And so if you drink that liquid, it will help to protect you against the same threats, the threats of the crocodile and the threats of the scorpions and the biting snakes and the spiders and all the other kind of things. That type of magic as well, of eating something or drinking something, you see all these different themes. You may see how they're kind of connecting from the eating, ancient Ombos eating magic to do with consuming the cannibal hymn and all this sort of stuff. How in a kind of attenuated form, in a symbolic form, we can continue with the same thing, that you can somehow absorb the magical power of a thing by physically absorbing some of the liquid. And this isn't peripheral. There are all sorts of secrets in there. Or maybe they're not so secret, but it lies at the heart of an awful lot of magic within Egypt. And this was remembered in later times, after the end of Egypt, in traditions known as the alchemical or rest, this liquid transfer of ideas from one state to another to kind of transfer the magic from an image to you. It's a huge and productive area of magic in its own sense. Okay, so, and that's just a kind of little bit really of some of the things that happened while they were preparing before the showdown between Horus and Set. I should say that before, although they're being phrased as the Horus as the kind of nemesis of Set or vice versa, originally, if you go back to this older era, the lunar period, you've got a kind of another myth, if you like, that's been rewritten in later times. And in this, Horus and Set are not nephew and uncle. They're actually twins. They're actually two brothers. And you can think about the mythology of twins and the two brothers as well, how that kind of resonates down the years. So that they were actually representing the different phases of the moon. So Horus and Set, the kind of waxing and waning moon. Horus more associated, I think, with the new moon. Set with the full moon, but there's an interplay between the two, which is quite benign in its own way. And actually, there's a twin entity called Hor-Seth, which is important, which is a kind of, I suppose you could say Horus is coming first there, right? Hor-Seth, and it's always said in that order as well. It has to be acknowledged. But this entity, the twin-headed entity of Horus and Seth together occurs in lots of important religious texts within the Egyptian tradition, and again has this protective role. It's almost like the twins together, they're both quite awesome, powerful entities, it has to be said. So what better than to combine them both together to protect ultimately the sun god in his passage through the underworld, and by extension to protect the earthly representation of the sun god, which would be the king, the actual reigning monarch, and also to protect them when they go through their apotheosis in the underworld. Let's say Horus is most famously known, probably from our point of view, as a falcon entity, a falcon god, and the mythology of the ancient falcon. See, the name Horus doesn't mean falcon. It means something completely different. So there may be a little bit of a sleight of hand there, but certainly there is this very old cult, which I mentioned before, from the center of the citadel of Horus, which is connected with a falcon deity, and a falcon deity, very, very important. Whether that is exactly the same as Horus is a moot point. Certainly the mythologies tend to coalesce over time. The most famous temple of Horus is surviving one anyway, is this magnificent temple in Edfu, which is not too far. It's about 15 kilometers from the original settlement of the people of Horus. It's a mystery why they moved from their original site. Perhaps this was on the river. It was a better location. So the Temple of Horus was rebuilt in the Greek period, but on prehistoric foundations, it has to be said, although not much of this has survived. Perhaps they will find more, because it's the sort of stuff that people didn't look for before, because you've got this amazing edifice which is full of books written on the walls, which themselves, each one of them is full of secrets and the mysteries of the temple and of alchemy and of incenses and of all sorts of stuff. The entire history of Egypt is written on the walls of that temple, and this is all connected with Horus and the things that he did. So that's the important one. So briefly then, I just wanted to say a little bit about, in the month of Horus, there's quite a lot of ritual material to choose from. I focus, because of on the lunar aspect of Horus specifically, and in this crocodile form called Kentichet, whose cult center wasn't at Edfu, but a place called Atribis, which is actually in the Delta. But often things in the Delta are kind of like a hologram or a parallel to things that happen everywhere. When people talk about Upper Egypt, they mean Upper Egypt, or do they mean Upper Egypt as about Lower Egypt? There's never one solution to any of these places or phrases. Originally, he was worshipped by some, especially by the Nubian pharaohs of Egypt from about the 8th century BC. So later on, really, this form of Horus became very, very popular, and but looking at the evidence from the calendar, the name seems to be embedded in the calendar for quite a long time. The name means possessor of the divine body, which again is some sort of mystery. It's associated with kingship as well, especially with the crown and all the attributes that you might associate with royalty within the Egyptian tradition: divine justice, mart, and creativity. So the crown, it leads to the wider sense of the crown. We're going to take it for granted, the crown, really, but it's drawing attention to the head and the mysteries of the head. And again, these are very old things that were explored in great detail in the Typhonian era, really, in the ancient Typhonian era. It never completely goes away. It gets relabeled and whatever. So it signifies a person's self-esteem and physical well-being, the crown. So it's not surprising that the ancient ritual comes from the New Kingdom, Egypt's New Kingdom, when kingship sort of gets revived under the Ramessids, and you have lots of interesting spells for protection and general well-being, especially of the kings and queens and the aristocracy, as some sort of vicarious thing for people in general. And interestingly as well that the Ramessid kings are famous for their secret or not so secret revival of the cult of Set, as well as all the other things to do with Horus and whatever is definitely there. So Horus, the moon, Horus Kentichet, the crocodile, is a kind of very earthy counterpart of Horus the sun. So you've got Horus the falcon, more connected with the sun cult, Rahul Quit and all this other stuff. This is much more lunar, but then also to do more with the underworld, and that is of great interest to us. So the ancient rite has strong lunar components to it, and probably was done, and I certainly, this is how I drawing it down into the crown of the head and into the forehead, which is what it's leading us into, so making a kind of virtual crown of it. The spell also mentions, I'll take you a few lines of it, a special book which you can inscribe on paper, which you use to recite to the moon, which is again gives you directly some of the techniques to do with the magic of the book. And like we talked a lot about earlier about how you can drink magic, but also the book itself, or just possessing the book and reading these spells for the Egyptians, and I think we think the same, that's what activates it, that brings it to life. You know, we tend to think, oh, you're supposed to know these things by heart, but actually the book, bell, book and candle, the book is kind of the important magical object in its own right. And just reading the book is a source of liberation, and it's a remarkable idea, this, that persists. So whensoever I read this book, I will be favoured daily. I will not hunger or experience thirst, neither will I know any sorrow. I will not hunger or experience thirst, neither will I know sorrow. My heart will not be afflicted, and I will never be imprisoned, and judgment will never be delivered against me. This is, again, a very, very important Horus thing to do with judgment, which, you know, you if you think about that thing, you'll see this in the mythology. If ever I go to jail in this particular spell, I'll be vindicated in the end. I'll get out and I will be vindicated. It's very sort of profound in a way. Adorations will be offered to me as if I were a god myself, from whom affection is never parted. There'll always be love coming my way. Adorations and lamentations will never take hold of me. People are never going to feel sorry. There's a kind of very positive thing about well-being. And the plague of the year will never harm me, nor oppression crush me down. Hail to you, Horus, who resides at Anubis, who judges the two lands from your boat. In the midst of all the gods, the jackal of the south, and Osiris, who strikes the rebel, and who journeys in the underworld, who roams as a bull who rejuvenates, great god, master of Nubia, to whom the two countries were given. May we rejoice in your name of Horus, Kenti Ket.